The atmosphere inside the House chamber crackled with an intensity that made even the most seasoned political observers lean forward in their seats. Speaker Mike Johnson stood elevated at the podium, his distinctive Louisiana drawl slicing through the charged air as his gaze swept across the Democratic side of the aisle with unmistakable disdain. This wasn't going to be just another routine exchange of parliamentary pleasantries. Everyone present could sense it. Something consequential was building, and the target was clear. Johnson had been circling for this opportunity, waiting for the perfect moment to publicly diminish Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative from Texas who had been making far too much noise for his comfort. His voice carried that particular edge of condescension, reserved for those moments when someone in power decides it's time to remind everyone else exactly who's in charge. The representative from Texas, he declared, each word dripping with barely disguised contempt, appears to believe she possesses greater understanding of constitutional principles than those of us who devoted our careers to studying them. Perhaps her energy would be better invested in comprehending how this institution actually operates rather than pursuing fleeting moments of internet fame. It was a calculated strike designed to humiliate and silence, the kind of public dressing down meant to make someone shrink into their seat and think twice before speaking up again. Gasps rippled through sections of the chamber. Some representatives exchanged knowing smirks. The cameras captured it all, broadcasting this confrontation to millions watching across the nation. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't avert her eyes or show even the slightest hint of intimidation. Instead, she rose from her seat with deliberate purpose, adjusted her microphone with steady hands, and allowed herself a smile, not the nervous kind that betrays uncertainty, but the smile of someone who knows exactly what's about to happen next, the kind that silently announces, "You just sealed your own fate." What unfolded over the following 3 minutes would fundamentally alter the power dynamics within that chamber. Mike Johnson entered this confrontation confident he was about to score easy political victories, demonstrating his authority while putting an upstart freshman in her place. What he got instead was a systematic dismantling so thorough, so precisely executed that even his own Republican colleagues would later confess off the record that challenging her had been a catastrophic miscalculation. Before we break down exactly what she said that made the Speaker of the House look like he desperately wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole, take a second to leave a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. And make sure you hit that subscribe button. You're about to witness what many political analysts are calling one of the most devastating political reversals in recent congressional history. Let's talk about Mike Johnson. At 52, he occupies the most influential legislative position outside the presidency itself, Speaker of the House of Representatives. His background is rooted in constitutional law, specifically from his years working with religious conservative legal organizations. He spent his career before Congress arguing cases centered on religious liberty, traditional values, and conservative interpretations of constitutional principle. Johnson didn't ascend to the speakership through the conventional route of decades spent climbing the leadership ladder. His rise was unconventional, emerging from the wreckage of the chaotic 2023 speaker elections. After Kevin McCarthy's dramatic ouster left the Republican conference fractured and desperate for anyone who could unite their warring factions, Johnson was relatively unknown on the national stage at that point. He'd served in Congress since 2017, but had never chaired major committees, never shepherded landmark legislation through passage, and remained largely invisible outside conservative activist circles. What he lacked in legislative accomplishments, however, he compensated for with ideological purity. Johnson's conservatism runs deep, shaped profoundly by his evangelical Christian faith, which he openly credits as the driving force behind his political positions. He advocates for strict constitutional interpretation, opposes reproductive rights, champions traditional marriage definitions, and maintains skepticism toward government intervention in social welfare. As Speaker, Johnson has struggled to project the authority his position demands. The razor-thin Republican majority means any handful of defections can torpedo his legislative agenda. He's constantly negotiating with the party's most extreme members while simultaneously trying to pass bills that have any realistic chance of becoming law. Johnson also carries the burden of being nobody's first choice for the job, a fact that breeds insecurity and occasionally manifests in overcompensation. He tries too hard to assert dominance, to prove he belongs in the chair, to demonstrate strength to skeptics within his own conference. That insecurity, that need to prove himself, led him directly into the trap of targeting Jasmine Crockett. Now, let's examine who was on the receiving end of his attack. By this point in her congressional career, Jasmine Crockett had already become a national figure. The 43-year-old civil rights attorney from Texas had generated viral moments repeatedly, systematically dismantling Nancy Mace with documented evidence, publicly questioning Mitch McConnell's cognitive capacity, and establishing herself as someone who absolutely refuses to back down regardless of who stands opposite her. What makes Crockett particularly formidable isn't just her political instincts. It's her professional foundation. Before entering politics, she spent over 15 years in courtrooms as a trial attorney. She knows how to construct airtight legal arguments, conduct devastating cross-examinations of hostile witnesses, and deliver closing statements that sway skeptical juries. She's also deeply versed in constitutional law, having handled numerous civil rights cases defending clients against government overreach, arguing First Amendment protections, due process violations, and equal protection principles. Crockett represents Texas's 30th district, encompassing diverse sections of Dallas, one of the most demographically varied constituencies in America. Her constituents are predominantly Black and Latino, working-class and middle-class families facing real struggles with health care access, voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic opportunity. She didn't arrive in Congress planning to follow traditional decorum or play by unwritten rules about deference to seniority. She came to fight for her constituents and demand accountability from those in power. And she'd already proven multiple times that she was exceptionally skilled at both. The confrontation erupted during debate over a continuing resolution to fund the government, one of those critical junctures where Congress must pass legislation or face shutdown. The Republican-controlled House had proposed funding that included substantial cuts to social programs, restrictions on reproductive health care access, and provisions Democrats viewed as deliberately designed to force rejection. Jasmine Crockett had taken the floor to speak against the legislation, delivering a passionate, detailed critique that cited specific provisions and their likely impacts on real people. Her speech was effective, clearly communicating why the Republican bill was problematic, and Republicans didn't appreciate it. They especially didn't appreciate that she was successfully conveying their legislation's flaws to the public. So Mike Johnson, wielding his authority as Speaker, decided to intervene, not through proper procedural channels, but through personal attack. The House chamber was packed that afternoon. Representatives from both parties filled their seats. C-SPAN cameras broadcast every moment live. Political reporters watched intently, ready to clip and amplify any dramatic exchanges. This wasn't just about one bill or one debate. This was about power dynamics, about who gets to speak and who gets silenced, about respect and representation. Johnson had been facing pressure from his party's right flank to show more aggression toward Democrats. Some Republicans felt he was too accommodating, too willing to compromise, too soft. They wanted demonstrations of strength. When Jasmine Crockett delivered her powerful indictment of Republican legislation, Johnson saw his opportunity, a chance to prove to his skeptical conference that he could take on the Democrats' rising star, publicly question her qualifications, and score points with his base. For Crockett, this was about something deeper than parliamentary procedure. She'd already faced dismissive attacks from Nancy Mace and others. Now the Speaker himself was deploying the same tactics. If she allowed it to stand without response, it would signal vulnerability, would embolden others to question her credentials and dismiss her arguments. More fundamentally, Johnson wasn't just attacking her personally. He was attacking what she represented, a young Black woman from Texas, a civil rights attorney, someone who fought her way into Congress to represent communities that have been historically marginalized and ignored. She couldn't let that stand, and she wouldn't. Jasmine Crockett had been properly recognized to speak on the continuing resolution. She stood on the Democratic side of the chamber, her voice clear and unwavering as she methodically laid out her opposition to the Republican funding bill. Mr. Speaker, she began, her tone professional yet forceful, I rise in opposition to this continuing resolution because it represents a fundamental betrayal of the American families who depend on their government to keep its promises. While this legislation is being marketed as fiscally responsible governance, what it actually accomplishes is gutting programs that millions of our citizens rely on for basic necessities. She held up the thick document containing the bill's text. Page 47 contains cuts to WIC, the nutritional assistance program serving low-income pregnant women and young children. Page 63 reduces Medicaid funding, which will force states to slash health care services for their most vulnerable populations. Page 89 imposes restrictions on Title X family planning that will shutter clinics in underserved communities across this nation. Republican members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Having the specific provisions of their legislation read aloud in plain language made it harder to hide behind abstract rhetoric about fiscal responsibility. But what troubles me most deeply, Crockett continued, is the profound hypocrisy embedded in this approach. Many of the members supporting this bill represent districts that benefit enormously from federal spending. They speak passionately about cutting government programs, yet they fight ferociously to protect military installations and agricultural subsidies in their own constituencies. She was landing blows, and Republicans felt it. Johnson, presiding as Speaker, leaned toward his microphone with a warning. The gentlewoman will confine her remarks to the legislation's substance and refrain from characterizing the motivations of fellow members. But Crockett, experienced attorney that she was, knew the rules probably better than Johnson himself. Mr. Speaker, she responded smoothly, I am addressing the legislation's substance. I am reading directly from the text and discussing its policy implications. Emboldened, Crockett pressed forward with even greater force. According to Congressional Budget Office analysis, the tax provisions in this legislation will save corporations over $40 billion while cutting $28 billion from social programs. We are literally transferring resources from poor families to corporations that are already recording record profits. A Republican member suddenly shouted, "Point of order." Johnson paused, visibly weighing his options. The chair will review the gentlewoman's remarks, Johnson said carefully. The gentlewoman may continue, but she must refrain from imputing motivations and confine herself to policy discussion. It was a compromise ruling, but it created the opening for what came next, Johnson's catastrophic mistake. Crockett wasn't backing down. Now, I've served in Congress for less than 2 years, but I spent more than 15 years as a civil rights attorney before arriving here. So, when I examine this bill and conclude that it prioritizes corporate interests over working families, that assessment isn't a partisan attack. It's a professional evaluation based on the actual legislative text. And I would encourage all members to actually read this legislation because I suspect some members voting for it haven't actually examined what's contained in these pages. That was Johnson's breaking point. He interrupted her, which speakers rarely do when a member has been properly recognized to speak. The gentlewoman will suspend. Johnson leaned forward, and his frustration was written across his face. The chair would remind the gentlewoman that while she may possess experience as an attorney, this is the United States Congress, not a courtroom. The traditions and procedures of this institution have been established over 230 years, and they deserve respect. But Johnson wasn't finished, and this is where he made his catastrophic error. The gentlewoman from Texas seems to think she knows more about constitutional law than those of us who actually studied it. Perhaps she should spend less time creating viral moments and more time learning how government actually works. This isn't social media, Congresswoman. This is the people's house, and it requires a level of understanding and decorum that I'm not sure the gentlewoman has fully grasped yet. The chamber went absolutely silent. Democrats looked shocked. Even some Republicans appeared visibly uncomfortable. Johnson had crossed far beyond procedural guidance into personal attack territory. He had questioned her credentials, dismissed her extensive legal experience, and suggested she didn't understand how government functions. It was insulting, condescending, and catastrophic, because he had just personally attacked a civil rights attorney and constitutional law expert in precisely the area where she was, in fact, significantly more qualified than he was. Jasmine Crockett stood there for a long moment, letting his words hang in the air. Then she smiled. "Mr. Speaker," she said calmly, "I would like to respond to your characterization of my credentials. May I continue with my allotted time?" Johnson realized too late that he had walked directly into a trap. "The gentlewoman may proceed," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," she began. "You just questioned my understanding of constitutional law and suggested I should spend less time on social media and more time learning how government works. So, let me respond to that assessment. You mentioned that you studied constitutional law. So, let's have a frank discussion about our respective qualifications. You graduated from Louisiana State University's Paul M. Mabert Law School in 1998, a perfectly respectable institution. Following graduation, you worked for Alliance Defending Freedom, a religious conservative legal organization. That's legitimate legal work. I graduated from the University of Houston Law Center. I then spent 15 years as a practicing civil rights attorney. I have argued cases involving First Amendment rights, 14th Amendment equal protection principles, 4th Amendment protections against unreasonable searches, and 5th Amendment due process guarantees." She began enumerating specific cases. "I have represented clients in federal district courts, state courts, and appellate courts. I have won cases that established precedents in Texas jurisprudence. I have defended individuals against unconstitutional police searches, discriminatory employment practices, and violations of voting rights." The chamber was completely silent. "So, with all due respect, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to practical application of constitutional law, not merely theoretical study, but actual courtroom experience defending constitutional rights, I am thoroughly qualified. In fact, my hands-on experience is substantially more extensive than yours." Several Democrats nodded. A few Republicans looked down at their desks. But Crockett wasn't finished. "You mentioned that this institution has 230 years of tradition and procedure." "That's absolutely correct. But since you brought up constitutional law, let's discuss it properly." She held up a pocket constitution. Article 1, Section 5, grants each House of Congress the power to establish its own rules. However, those rules must still comply with the Constitution itself, particularly the First Amendment's protections. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, including political speech. As a member of Congress, I possess not merely the right, but the constitutional duty to speak about legislation and its impacts. You as Speaker have the authority to enforce House rules, but you do not possess the authority to silence members simply because you disagree with their arguments or find them politically inconvenient. Several Democrats began nodding vigorously. "When you interrupted me to suggest I don't understand how government works, you weren't enforcing a House rule. You were attempting to intimidate me into silence. That's not neutral presiding. That's silencing dissent." Then she shifted to an even more personal level. "You also accused me of being more interested in social media than substance. Let's address that claim. Yes, my speeches sometimes go viral. Do you know why? Because I speak clearly about how legislation affects real human beings. I don't hide behind jargon and procedure. I explain what bills actually do. This legislation cuts $28 billion from social programs. When I state that fact and it gets shared widely, that's not performance. That's transparency. Perhaps if more members explained their votes in plain English, Americans would have greater faith in this institution. And as for learning how government works, I would point out that you've been Speaker for less than 1 year. You've struggled to pass basic legislation. You faced multiple rebellions from your own conference. You've had to rely on Democratic votes to avoid shutdowns." Her words cut like surgical instruments. "So perhaps before questioning whether I understand how government functions, you should reflect on whether your leadership approach is actually proving effective." The Republican side sat in stone silence, but Crockett had saved her most devastating observation for last. Mr. Speaker, there's one additional matter I need to address. You have now attacked my credentials, questioned my motives, and suggested I don't understand government. This is not the first time a young woman of color in Congress has faced this particular brand of dismissiveness. We have witnessed it directed at Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman Omar, Congresswoman Bush, and numerous others. She leaned into her microphone. There appears to be a consistent pattern. When women of color speak passionately about policy, we are told we're too emotional, too focused on attention, not serious enough. But when white men speak with identical passion, they're characterized as principled and strong. The room was electric. I want to be absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker. I am not too emotional. I am not unqualified. I am not here to generate viral moments for their own sake. I am here because the citizens of Texas's 30th District elected me to represent their interests, and I will continue to speak for them loudly, clearly, and persistently, whether you or anyone else finds that convenient or comfortable. She paused, then delivered her final devastating line. Now, if you would like to engage in an actual debate about constitutional law, I am fully prepared. But if you're simply going to abuse your position as Speaker to silence members who challenge your party's agenda, then you're not upholding this House's traditions. You're betraying them. And no amount of procedural authority or appeals to decorum can disguise that fundamental truth. The room was frozen, completely frozen. Democrats sat stunned. Republicans didn't know how to react. And Mike Johnson sat motionless in the Speaker's chair, his face a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and shock. He had entered this confrontation confident he would put Crockett in her place. Instead, she had just systematically dismantled him before the entire Congress and a national audience. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words emerged. Finally, he simply said, "The gentlewoman's time has expired." The chair recognizes the gentleman from California. He moved on, refusing to engage further because what could he possibly say? She had out-argued him on constitutional law, exposed his double standards, called out his abuse of authority, all while maintaining perfect decorum. Jasmine Crockett gathered her materials and sat down, her expression composed. She had said exactly what needed to be said, and everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Before Crockett had even taken her seat, clips were spreading across every platform. Within minutes, hashtags exploded, Jasmine Crockett constitutional lesson, receipt queen. Every major outlet covered it. CNN ran fireworks erupt as Speaker Johnson clashes with Representative Crockett. Texas Democrat delivers devastating response. MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell said, "This wasn't merely political. It was educational." Crockett demonstrated that expertise matters, credentials matter, and when you attack someone on substance, you'd better be prepared for a response with even greater substance. Johnson's office went into crisis mode, releasing weak statements that social media demolished. Johnson himself tried downplaying it, but when pressed about regretting his attack, he deflected awkwardly, which only made things worse. Democratic leadership praised Crockett effusively. Republicans were publicly divided but privately frustrated. The confrontation fundamentally changed Johnson's approach to presiding. He became noticeably more cautious, less likely to make editorial comments from the chair. For Crockett, the moment catapulted her to even higher prominence. Her fundraising surged over $3 million in 1 week. She received more prominent committee assignments, became one of the most sought-after media voices, and transformed from politically well-known to a genuine household name. Young attorneys, particularly women of color, reached out, expressing how her example inspired them. She became a symbol of using expertise to fight for justice. The broader implications were significant. It demonstrated expertise still matters. Crockett won because she genuinely knew constitutional law better than Johnson. It illustrated the danger of making conflicts personal. Johnson's error was attacking credentials rather than policy. It showed old congressional deference rules are crumbling, younger members reject automatic deference to seniority. The power of preparation was evident. Crockett succeeded because she was comprehensively ready. And social media proved its role as an equalizer. Johnson's formal authority couldn't overcome Crockett's viral moment. Months later, it continues being referenced. "Don't pull a Mike Johnson" became shorthand for "don't attack someone in their area of expertise." Johnson remains speaker, but diminished. Crockett continues with the same fire and intelligence, having proven she belongs and won't be silenced. Johnson now treats her with careful formality, never again attempting to question her credentials because he learned the hard way that when you come for Jasmine Crockett, you better be prepared for her to come back twice as hard. And she always has the receipts. What did you think of this showdown? Did Johnson cross a line, or was her response too harsh? Drop your opinion in the comments. If this left you speechless, subscribe for more explosive political analysis. Like if you think Crockett is one of Congress's most effective members, and share with someone who needs to see what genuine expertise looks like defending itself. Comment your dream constitutional law debate matchup, Crockett versus who? Here's the lesson: never let anyone make you doubt your expertise when you know you're qualified. Crockett showed us the best response to credential questioning isn't anger. It's calmly demonstrating competence. 5 takeaways: master your field so thoroughly nobody can question your expertise. Never be intimidated by titles. Crockett didn't care about Johnson's position. When challenged, compare qualifications directly. Maintain composure under attack. Emotional control makes arguments more powerful. Call out double standards and systemic patterns. The world needs more people willing to stand up to authority when it's exercised unjustly, whether in workplace meetings, courtrooms, classrooms, or Congress. Remember, expertise combined with truth will always be more powerful than titles combined with empty authority. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next explosive political moment analysis. Democracy works best when citizens know what's actually happening, not partisan filtered versions, but full context and real stakes. Stay informed. Stay engaged. And never stop demanding accountability from those wielding power in your name. We'll see you in the next one.